In 2015, when the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted, there was a very strong consensus that we would be able to eradicate child labor by 2025. However, we have not succeeded in doing this. We have made some progress, but the problem is that eradicating child labor is not simply a matter of prohibiting it in domestic legislation or in international treaties. It requires that we focus on providing low-income countries in particular with more support for parents not being forced to send their children to work and to remove them from school. It requires that we invest more in quality education that provides the right incentives for parents to send their children to school. It requires that we support social protection so that families are not faced with economic insecurity, obliging them to get their children to work. In other terms, we will not be able to eradicate child labor without a much broader development effort, and that is why we're still failing. We have today some 138 million children who are still in child labor, and 54 million are doing precarious, dangerous work in the worst forms of child labor as defined in international law. I think the key problem is that many low-income countries still rely on cheap labor in order to maintain a position in global supply chains. In other terms, their comparative advantage is in keeping their population in poverty. And in many countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where most child labor today is concentrated, having cheap workers is a way to be attractive to investors and to entering global supply chains. That is the major problem. We have to change these incentives and make sure that paying workers better, treating them better, is in the future going to be the competitive advantage that countries are looking for. That requires that we control much better how the major buyers are defining their relationships to suppliers. Buyers should ensure that they demand not only low prices from their suppliers, but also that they demand fair, equitable working conditions, including a living wage for all the workers. In other terms, the buyers should not be complicit in child labor, they should not be complicit in exploitative labor, and they should support the efforts of low-income countries from which they source production to improve labor standards, including wages. That is the only way to go, but it requires that we do more than adopt a purely punitive approach. It requires that we act responsibly to provide opportunities to the families, that we invest more in education and social protection. Over the past 15 years, there's been a major development in the world of human rights, which is the rise of extraterritorial human rights obligations. And there are two dimensions to this. First, one dimension is that all states should do what they can to contribute to the realization of human rights wherever they can have an influence, including in development cooperation, in their trade and investment policies, and this is why the idea of policy coherence for development is so well aligned with extraterritorial human rights obligations. And the second dimension is that human rights duties are being imposed on transnational corporations that control global supply chains and that have a huge impact in the countries in which they operate to improve the standards in the world of work. There is a negotiations that has started in 2014 on a new legally binding instrument, a new international treaty on business and human rights that would codify a due diligence obligation on major companies to look into whether their suppliers, their business partners are acting in compliance with human rights. The European Union has, inspired by this discussion, adopted a directive in 2024 on due diligence for environmental rights and human rights, and we absolutely must pursue the implementation of these instruments that are a very powerful tool to make sure that globalization ultimately works for the better, for the promotion of human rights, rather than globalization undermining human rights by encouraging cost competitiveness policies in the countries concerned.